Boys. Boys, this room is a mess. I need you to clean it up right now.
Okay. Okay.
Boys, I'm serious. I need this room cleaned up right now. Now get going.
Okay.
Boys, we still haven't made any progress. I think I'll have to get out the wooden spoon. Do you want me to get out the wooden spoon? Now let's get going. Boys, you leave me no alternative. I'm going to have to call your dad. Seems like once again, it's Mom doing all the cleaning up. It just isn't right. It's not fair. And furthermore, you're making me wonder what type of TV shows you're watching. It really worries me that it just seems like it mesmerizes you and you're not even listening. I feel like I'm always talking to myself. It's just unfair. And I'm talking to my father about it, and I'm...
And welcome back to another session of Growing Kids God's Way. Anne-Marie and I have the opportunity to chat with our parents after each session, just as you have fellowship where you're at, and we're able to talk with them and encourage them. And what we have found from our conversations, Anne-Marie, is that there is quite a bit of excitement about this particular lesson because it signals a turn in the series. We are now going to be talking about biblical discipline, motivating our children through encouragement and motivating our children, yes, through correction. In this particular session, we're going to be talking about the standard. We're going to be asking the question and answering it, what is true biblical obedience?
And in the process, hopefully as you as parents learn what the standard is and what biblical obedience also is, that the scenario that we just observed, that threatening, repeating parent, well, hopefully we'll see less and less of him or her around the house.
That's right. We want that parent to disappear. Get ready. Join us. We'll be right back. Well, some of you have been waiting for this particular lesson. We are now moving into our discipline series, but we hope and we trust that you clearly understand by now that you simply cannot be teaching your children and working with your children in matters of discipline without having a purpose for it. And I think that the first 8 sessions has laid down for you the moral purpose. We're going to begin talking about the principles of obedience in this particular lesson, but first we need to define biblical discipline. Again, if I invite you to your outlines, let's begin. What is discipline? Well, we know that the Bible exhorts parents to discipline their children. The cultural definition of discipline implies spanking and punishment. I think that we have all heard this before. Moms will have a child that will act up, and a mother will respond and say, for that, Mommy must discipline you. That term is commonly used, and in fact, that term is commonly misused. But when the Bible speaks about discipline, it implies one thing, training. In parentheses, you could write heart training. Biblical discipline is all about getting to the heart of a child, helping the child gain moral self-control over his negative emotions, helping a child gain self-control over their behavior, over their actions, over their tongue, over negative feelings, helping your children to do the right things. That's what biblical discipline is all about. The ultimate goal is to help them appreciate the peaceable fruit of righteousness. That's why God brings discipline into our life. That's why we are to bring discipline into the life of our children. The process is a matter of training. That's what discipline is all about. But the place we start to understand discipline, because we're going to spend a number of weeks and a lot of energy answering many questions. The place you start, though, is with the objective standard. What is obedience? This lesson is dedicated to answering that question. We know that Ephesians 6:1 instructs children to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. We also know that Colossians 3:20 instructs children to be obedient to their parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Obedience is absolutely essential to family government. Let me ask you, why bring your children to the standard of obedience if you have no moral reason, if there's no moral purpose? And is it really just a matter of obedience? Should not the process be as important as the outcome? If we go all the way back to the development of your child's conscience, we touched on this earlier. You can abuse the process of training and bringing your children to obedience. You can wrongly create a condition in which your children will obey you because they're afraid you're not going to love them, or because they're going to feel guilty if they don't obey you. That is not pure motivation for obedience. That is not the biblical way. We want to make sure that you do not manipulate your children into obedience. Many parents do that, because the only thing they're seeking is a type of compliance that will make their life easier, and they're losing out on the discipline, the training portion of what biblical discipline is all about. What is obedience? There will be many times that the reasonableness of your instructions as mom and dad will be rejected and therefore strongly opposed by your children. May I point out that you've never had to train your children to disobey you? They sort of like naturally will do it. None of you, I'm sure in this room, ever trained your child to say no to you or to run away when you gave them instructions. They just have a natural inclination to do that. So there will be times that they will reject your instruction and your wisdom. Therefore, teach your children to obey, and obey according to the character of obedience. This is where we begin. You remember a couple of lessons ago, we talked about parental authority and that you're going to guide and direct your young children by your authority. Well, when you do that, you're going to bring them to true biblical obedience. But the whole goal is not to keep your child in obedience. The goal is to be able to transfer your child from a response of obedience, that the Greek word is hupakuo, that is the mandate, and to transfer a child to a place where they will submit, hupatasso, to your leadership out of the love of your relationship. What does it look like? Genesis 2:22 gives us an example of obedience. You remember the scene. The text is talking about God speaking to Abraham to take his son Isaac to sacrifice. We pick up with these words. God speaking to Abraham, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall show you." Then in Genesis 22:3, this is what Abraham did. Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. Now please notice what Abraham did. 3 things. He rose up early, he prepared himself, and he did that which God commanded him. Now, from this little narrative, we could really pull out 4 characteristics of biblical obedience. May I suggest, number 1, that obedience is to be immediate. Immediate. Number 2, that obedience is to be complete. Immediate, complete. Number 3, without challenge. Abraham did not put his hands on his side and say, "Why? Why are you having me do this? Why are you having me take my child to a foreign land?" Number 4, it's without complaint. It's without murmuring. Now let me ask you, given those 4 characteristics, let me ask you guys in this class right here. So when you call your child, how does your child respond? Does your child come joyfully? Does your child come with, "Yes, Mommy, here am I, may I serve you"? Probably not. On the other hand, does your child complain? Does your child come immediately, or does your child go the other way? How does your child respond to you? What is your child characterized by? Is your child characterized by immediate, complete responses, without challenge, without complaint? Folks, we need to train our children to the standard. Look, 1 Samuel 15:22 and 23 drives home the point that obedience is very important in the mind of God. You remember the story. Saul has disobeyed the voice of the Lord. Samuel the prophet now is bringing rebuke to Saul. In these verses, this is what Samuel is saying to Saul. "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and insubordination as iniquity and idolatry. Those are pretty powerful words. That is describing God's love for his children that are obedient. He is actually equating disobedience and rebellion with sorcery activities. And if you do a quick survey in the Old Testament, you will realize that God had commanded death to anyone who got involved in witchcraft, in sorcery activities. So God has, first of all, a very lofty view of obedience. Now, how do parents wrongly discourage bringing a child to first-time obedience, to biblical obedience? Let's take a sampling of some of the more common ways this happens. And you measure whether or not this may fall into your family model. First of all, parents wrongly train their children by being threatening, repeating parents. Threatening, repeating parents. This is a rather common scene. Mom may start out with, honey, I want you to pick up your toys. And the child does nothing. In fact, the child actually pretends that never heard the mom in the first place. Excuse me, did you hear me? I want you to pick up your toys. Now she's gone for number 2. Child is not moving. I'm speaking to you, pick them up. I mean it, pick them up. And then if you don't have enough repeats there, you'll start with the threats. And so, young lady, do I have to get the wooden spoon? And the child is still playing, ignoring you. And so then you do something silly. You actually go to the kitchen, you open the drawer, you get the wooden spoon out, you bring it, and you hold it right there. You show, do you see this? Now, depending on how upset you are, the voice change, how high your blood pressure is, the child will make a determination, oh, you mean it now. And then the child begins to pick up the toys. Mom, I'm picking up the toys. And you say, well, I shouldn't have to tell you more than once. Well, of course you should if you're training a child that way, because the child is responding to you, the way you are training. The mother who first coaxes, then threatens, then bargains with the child, then pretends to punish a little is only making a bad situation worse. Her hope for compliance is greater than her will to enforce it. Folks, you can't parent that way. This type of parental training only produces contempt for your authority. If you're known as a threatening, repeating parent, that's what's happening. Ignorance is not to blame here. This is so interesting. When parents act so wrongly in not requiring first-time obedience, you can't blame ignorance. You can't blame the child for not understanding. For even the child has figured out the obvious. You don't mean it. You don't mean it. That's why the child will wait and have to figure out when, in fact, you're really ready to act, and then the child acts. That is not bringing about true biblical obedience. A second parent type that wrongly trains a child, discourages the child to first-time obedience, is the bribing parent. Now, we're going to talk about the bribing parent more in our next session, but I will introduce this parent type to you now. Are you a bribing parent? Before you get into the store, do you say to your children, now, look, I don't want what we saw last week here. If you're good in the store today, Mommy's going to buy you a special treat, but you've got to be good. Now, folks, what you just did is you just bribed your child. You said, let's make a deal here. You give me good behavior, and I'll give you candy at the end. That's a bribe. That's not going to bring a child to obedience. The only thing that's going to do is increase the stakes, because next week, what are you going to give me for being good? There's nothing intrinsic. That's not a goal incentive, again, as we will explain more in our next session. You know, a bribe is so offensive to God that when he originally gave the children of Israel the law of God, from the Ten Commandments straight through all of the teachings right through the Exodus chapter 23, that initial giving of the law, guess what was included? God said in Exodus 23:8, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Bribing was one of the initial laws that were given by God to the children of Israel. So stay away from bribing. It's a terrible thing. Why are you doing that with your children? Do you say, honey, if you get up in your chair, Mommy will give you some gumdrops, but you got to get up in your chair. That's not how we lead our children. There's a much better way. Now let me relax you a little bit, because you all look a little guilty. Listen. Anne-Marie and I bribed our children. There, do you feel better? Anne-Marie and I were threatening repeating parents. You know what? We're all threatening repeating parents. We've all bribed our children. There's no question about it. Yes, we admit. There were days that we said to either Amy and Jenny, look, kid, put this candy in your mouth. Don't talk while we're in the store. Yes, we admit we did that. Here's what you have to evaluate. What are you guys characterized by as moms and dads? Are you characterized by being a bribing parent? Are you characterized by being a threatening repeating parent? Will there be occasions when you say, honey, you need to pick up? Come on, let's get going. Let's pick up. Well, yes, of course there will be. But are you characterized by holding to a lower standard when it comes to instilling what obedience is all about? That becomes the issue. Because the fact is we're all threatening repeating parents. We're all bribing parents. Let's go on a little bit further. You're going to read in your workbook all about negotiating in conflict and the misuse of compassion. I just want to make a note and direct you to your reading. But I want to go on to principles of instruction because, practically speaking, how do we communicate our instructions to our children in such a way to make obedience attractive? So let's talk about this. Number one, here's one of the first principles, and this really is directed to mom and dad. If you speak in a way which requires an answer or an action, you should expect an immediate and complete response. Now, this very first principle speaks to parental expectation. If you don't expect them to obey, they probably are not going to obey. You've got to have that level of expectation. You can't be giving your kids instruction and hoping that they will obey. You've got to have the attitude that I gave instructions, my instructions are very reasonable. I am expecting you to obey. So the first principle is, what is your expectation? If you expect little, that's exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get little. If you expect much more, that's what you're going to get. Principle 2 says this. When giving instructions, are you ready? Parents should say what they mean and mean what they say. Such a simple principle, but so often violated. Say what you mean what you say. Do you want them to go to bed? Then don't say, honey, would you like to go to bed? No. No. What do you mean no? You ask them if they want to go to bed. Say what you mean and mean what you say. If you want them to go to bed, then say, honey, this is time for bed and we need to head into your bedroom or into the bathroom to get your teeth brushed and I'll be in to tuck you in. Say that. If you want to give them an option, there's nothing wrong with it. If you want to say, honey, you look a little tired. Do you want to go to bed early or do you want to go to bed? And the child says, no, Mommy, I want to stay up. That's fine too. But say what you mean and mean what you say. Listen, folks, you could jot this in. Never give an instruction that you do not intend to have obeyed. That follows along with this very principle. Don't give instructions to your children if you have no intentions for those instructions to be followed. Now, we've got to break this particular principle down, and I got some subcategories I want to speak to you about. A on your outline is understanding objective and subjective obedience. This is important because it's tied to first-time obedience and complete obedience. Understanding the objective nature of first-time obedience is of great importance and great value to you. Now follow this, so you've got a place to fill in some key words on your outline. When parents require the standard, first-time obedience, the child alone, only the child, determines when he will be corrected or punished. Only the child can determine that. When you hold to the standard, when you call your children to first-time obedience, objectively speaking, only the child can determine when they will be punished for their wrongdoing. Parents can't determine it. Only the child brings that on. You see, the consistency of God's moral standard makes obedience objective since the parent does not react arbitrarily. What do we mean by that? Well, let's go to the next paragraph. Anything less than first-time obedience brings subjective punishment. The child is governed really by his parent's present resolve, and that is what keeps the child in a state of continuing conflict, confusion, and insecurity. You see, by nature, children are gamblers. They will take a chance that you're going to do nothing. And if you are inconsistent with first-time obedience, you create a greater propensity for them to want to take that chance. They will tiptoe across the line, enjoy their sin, dash back, in hopes of not disturbing the sleeping giant, the parent. Obedience is no longer objective, but it's subjective. Now follow this. Consequences are no longer tied to disobedience, but to the mood and whim of the parent at any particular moment. In other words, if you are not consistent with first-time obedience, and you're into threatening, repeating, and today we're going to deal with this issue the first time, but tomorrow it's not a big deal, and I'm not as tired, and so, or I'm more tired, and I'm not going to deal with it, and I'm going to repeat more, and then the next day it's a different standard. That creates subjective obedience. That creates insecurity in the child. You see, because the child is out there wondering, today, what will determine the line? What will determine the consequence? What will determine when punishment will come? The child never knows. Nothing is consistent. How can you have a secure child with that? That's why first-time obedience is objective. When you are consistent with first-time obedience, then only the child knows when they're going to bring punishment into their life or correction, because the child knows each time I violate mom and dad's instruction, the line is clearly established. When you are a threatening, repeating parent, when first-time obedience is not important, it's all subjective. Maybe mom will call me 3 times, maybe mom will call me 5 times, maybe dad will get on me the first time. The child will always be left wondering. That's why the threatening, repeating parent fosters a fearful, subjective response. The failure of parents to maintain a consistent standard only serves to lure the child into sin by causing him to think that he will get away with something that he probably shouldn't be getting away with. Now let's define further then obedience, especially coming off of number 2, and we want to describe obedience. There's what we call immediate obedience in time. This is one characteristic of obedience. There's others, but this is one, immediate obedience in time. Now what is this? There will be times in your child's life when you call your child that they need to immediately come to you. It is not a matter of negotiation. This may be a health and safety issue. It may save their child's life. I think reaching way back many, many years ago when we began to teach the importance of first-time obedience, friends of ours shared a story of what happened the week after they heard this teaching. And they were working with their son very diligently after the class on first-time obedience. Dad had a ladder up on the roof. He was working on the roof. And he had come in to the house and he went to the bathroom to take a shower, left the ladder up, never expecting that his 2.5-year-old son, who was curious about what was going on, left the living room and drifted outside, climbed the ladder, went on top of the roof, a house that is skirted with concrete. Now imagine if that was your child. Mom, as you moms do, knew there was something strangely silent. And so she called out, "Ryan." And then she worked in the living room, "Ryan." And then she worked outside, "Ryan, where are you?" And from the peak of the roof, Ryan is standing up. And he's pointing, "Birds, birds." Now, let's imagine if that was your child. This mother said to Ryan, "Ryan." She used her not her nice mommy voice, she used her urgency mommy's voice. You've got to do that sometimes. Don't be afraid of that. "Ryan, sit down now." And that little guy went right down. And then she said, "You stay right there." Now, let me ask you if that was your child. If you said, "Sit down," what would your child do? Would your child, no. Would your child try to escape the other way? Would your child go down? Would your child say, "Why?" and not respond physically in action? What would your child do? You see, there will come a day, the probability is great, that your child's going to be heading for that road. And if your child is not cued into your voice command, you could very easily have a child seriously injured or taken from you. Someday, this may save your child's life. That's immediate obedience in time. That's a child who hears and knows by the sound of mom and dad's voice. That is, no, stop. Many stories of children's lives being saved by that very process. Now, what can aid this? What can aid a child to come about with first-time obedience? Here's a simple suggestion. Work on this, moms, dads, all of you. You need to get a yes, mommy, yes, daddy. This is so helpful. When we get into the question and answer session with Anne Marie, we're going to really be talking to you about this, because you're going to ask us questions, and we're going to come back and saying, you need to work on yes, mommy, yes, daddy. When a child speaks, when a child hears themselves say, himself or herself say, yes, Mommy, that creates a condition in which the child is going to commit themselves in action. When you call your child, when you say, Vicky, come to Daddy, and if you have no yes, Daddy, how do you know if she's going to commit? How do you know she's even heard you? In fact, she could actually play like she didn't hear you. But when you train your child to that verbal response, yes, Daddy, yes, Mommy, that is going to help your cause. You see, most of your discipline problems, well, at least 50% of them, come as a result of your child not obeying you the first time. What will help you if you bring your child to first-time obedience? We took our granddaughter, Caitlin, out to a park. And it was a new park, and it was a lot of fun. It was exciting. And sometimes Grandma and Grandpa and her older cousin, we were going to go in that direction. But little cute Caitlin, she wanted to go in that direction. And sometimes, you know, you could see that foot, and we would say, Caitlin, Grandpa needs to hear a yes, Grandpa. And we would get a yes, Grandpa. And then she would turn around and she would come. Now, why? If there was no yes, Grandpa, I'm not sure we would get the same response, because the child actually commits themselves through their own verbal response. Here's another one. When you're working with these little ones, get them to look in your face. Do not speak to your child while your child is looking everywhere but at you. You know when you're giving them instructions. You know when you're bringing correction. No, honey, you look at Mommy's face. Put your eyes on Mommy's face when Mommy's talking to you. Keep that. That's another help. Let's go on a little bit further. There's also what we call timely compliance. Timely compliance. That simply means there's a task to be accomplished. It's not something of great urgency. It's not stop. It's not sit down. It's not come to Mommy now, but a task to be accomplished. In this case, maybe the child has to put their toys away because we're going to have dinner in a few minutes. Now, here's the aid. Here's the big help. And ladies, I want you to get this, because this is not just for your children. This is for the big guy with you tonight. This is for your husbands. We husbands need this. Here's what you want to do. Children, husbands, you want to let them have their 5-minute warning. Very important. If you want to make obedience attractive, you must give a 5-minute warning. It's going to help you. Now, why a 5-minute warning? Because we husbands and your children, when we get involved in a board game or a project, and if you come out, I know with Anne Marie, they used to come out, and she would say in the garage if I was working, okay, honey, put it away, dinner's on the table. That is so frustrating for we who are still playing, because there's a type of emotional energy that we have going for us. Your children are playing games, and they're spinning the circle or whatever it may be. They're throwing their dice. And you come say, let's put the game away. We have dinners on the table. I want you to wash up now. You got this emotional energy going, and you want it stopped, just like that. But if you say to your children, husbands, if you say to them, honey, in 5 minutes, Mom's going to ask you to put the game away and get washed up for dinner. What ends up happening is you are allowing your children to emotionally prepare themselves to surrender to your instructions. You have just made obedience attractive. Something as simple as that. So when you want to give instructions on a task, as often as possible, why don't you throw in this 5-minute warning? Let's conclude this portion of the lecture by looking at principle number 3. If I ask my child to do something and he disobeys, my child's in sin. If I am characterized by repeating myself in hopes that he will obey, then I'm the one who's in sin as a parent. And I know that this could be really frightening, folks, but it is a reality. In the parenting process, my job is to introduce my child through training to the very character of God. Everything that I do, I'm supposed to be directed towards him. That's why I put the moral law of God into their hearts, realizing that they're not in a regenerate state yet, but they're moving towards that. I am to draw a picture of who God is by introducing them to the moral law of God. The point is this: if the parenting process corrupts the message, then the one who's in sin is I. You have just been informed of this. What are you going to do about it? If you are characterized by being a threatening, repeating parent, You've got to go before the Lord. You've got to ask the Lord, Lord, show me. Lord, bring encouragement to my life. If you're characterized by bribing or trying to manipulate the child, then you've got to go before the Lord. Lord, help me come to the standard so that I could bring my child not only to the standard, but to a true picture of who you are. Let's stop right there. I'm going to have Anne Marie, I know, just looking at her, she is loaded with things that she wants to share. We're going to have our wrap-up right now. Well, let's do that, honey, and let's take their questions right afterwards. What is obedience? Quite a topic that we hit tonight in this session, Anne Marie. I know that we can go on for several weeks because there is quite a bit involved, especially talking to a young generation of parents who want to do what is right and come to the standard. Let's fine-tune some of that teaching with some of your wisdom.
Well, thank you for that. And it was. I was sitting there listening and following along as well and thinking about you as parents, but as young parents, but even as me as an older parent and as a grandparent, and how much these principles still apply in my life as well. And there's a scripture in Proverbs in chapter 30 and verse 5. It says that every word of God is pure. He is a shield to those who put their trust in him. And early in the lesson, Gary was talking about the issue of trust that we're building with our children and calling them to obedience. And they do want to trust us, and this is all part of the process, and how we can know that everything that God shares with us, he is trustworthy, and his word is pure. So as parents are really even thinking about, you talked about the 5-minute warning. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that's a vehicle. But that vehicle is going to help even make you more trustworthy and trust in God's word of not exasperating your children. None of us want to exasperate our children, but we know when we call them to obedience, because sometimes they don't want to obey, they can appear to be exasperated or frustrated. But when you're calling your child to obedience and they're giving you that appearance that they're exasperated, don't worry about that exasperation. It's the exasperation that you cause, for example, when you say it's time to come for dinner and you've not given them that 5-minute warning. So that can become a very powerful tool to make God's word continue to be pure even in their life.
Now, what we're not saying is that every time you give instructions to your children that are timely that you need to give them a 5-minute warning. What we are saying is that you want to be characterized by being fair and flexible when you do give instructions.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that does too, and we'll probably talk about it in some future lessons, but giving your children a way of escape. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says there's no temptation that has overcome us, but that God doesn't give us a way of escape. And so that 5-minute warning, again, just a simple little tool. It covers a lot of biblical principles in one sense of that we can, tools that we can give our children to help them to find obedience attractive.
That's right. That's exactly what parents need to do, is to help our children in that cause. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so, I mean, those are just a few of the thoughts as you were teaching. The other thing too, I know you talked about discipline, and if you think about it, it is training, but it also comes from the root of disciple, and that's really what we are with our children. We are discipling our children, and any discipleship takes time. It's a process, and it isn't something that you're going to achieve in the next couple of weeks.
This gets back to what I said earlier, honey. There's a purpose for you folks in training your children and disciplining your children. There's a moral agenda. Can you imagine if you had no moral direction? If there was no kingdom cause? Why would you correct your children? It doesn't even make sense. There's no urgency. Yet because we are in the Christian community, because there is an urgency, because we are, well, in one sense, we're participating with God and being kingdom builders of a new generation, there's reason why we will, with urgency, rightly discipline our children and bring them to the standard. Honey, should we go to questions right now?
I think that would be a good idea.
Listen, we're going to give you a chance because this is going to, well, take some time to get through all these questions. Where do we begin here? Okay, Eleanor has one. Eleanor, start us off this session.
I have a question on obedience. We have a 6-year-old son that is not sitting still for instruction, and today I learned that I'm supposed to be having him say, "Yes, Mommy," also. How am I going to get him to do this?
Now, honey, you've heard this question several times already in the parenting process and discipling of young moms. Is it always the same answer?
You're right. We have to start somewhere. You've got a little guy that's moving, and you want to teach him the yes, Mommy. Part of it at 6, and that's the beauty as your children do get a little bit older, you do sit them down. Or if you need to, you sit him on your lap and actually hold him there and give him these instructions and say, you know, we're working on obedience. Hopefully this is not a new topic for many of your children, but it might be for some, that this is going to be the standard. And when Mommy gives you instructions, you need to look at Mommy's face. You need to look at Mommy's eyes. And it's going to take some time with some children. You actually literally hold their little face. And it's going to be a process. What we don't really want you to get into, and we, again, will cover this in future lessons, is the issue of a power struggle. It's going to take time. You need to be patient, because you could spend a good deal of time with a child that is this active and not wanting to sit still. But that would be the starting place, taking their face, doing it in a period of non-conflict. Don't do it when, you know, they've done something wrong and you're trying to give instruction. But do it, and role play. That's the other thing you can do too. With if you've got older children, incorporate them in as a husband and wife. One be the parent, one be the child, and you role play for this as well. Those are just some starting points, at least.
Good. Good. Okay. Question. Okay. Right here.
What are your thoughts on using 1, 2, 3 to get your child to obey?
Do you use 1, 2, 3, or do you have neighbors who use 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, we've seen it used and tried.
Well, you know, personally, 1, 2, 3. Usually, parents will say, "I'm counting to 1. I'm counting to 2." When we're usually asked that question, I would turn back to the parent and ask, "Well, what happens when you finally get to 3?" And they say, "Oh, well, we never get to 3." Well, why not? Well, because our children know that if I say 3, boy, they're in big trouble. What we would say then is simply take what you were going to do at 2 and bring it back to 1. Then you're going to have first-time obedience. There's really no reason to go 1, 2, 3. You want to come to first-time obedience. Your child will. If your child's able to come to obedience before 3, they're certainly able to come to obedience at 1. So what else on that, honey?
No, the only thing I was going to say, really, in essence, they haven't come to obedience when you give them the third opportunity. And we had a saying in our house, delayed obedience is disobedience. And there is just, it was first time.
Right. Okay. We got some other questions here. Okay, Ms. Vicki has a question.
Our youngest is just turning 1. Is he too young to be learning first-time obedience?
Yeah, you know what? A 1-year-old is going to learn obedience, but they will learn obedience in the context of their age. Obviously, we're not talking about a child that's going to crawl to you and say, "Yes, Mommy," in some kind of gesture or sign it to you. But they do have obedience. For example, in our toddler series, we teach moms to teach their babies to take hold of their tray or to keep their hands out of the food. Well, that, Vicki, is a type of obedience. Your child can learn that. Even before that, when the child wants to grab that spoon that you're going to put their food into their mouth, and they grab it, and that's, "Oh, no, Mommy will feed you." You're instilling, even there in those early months, a type of obedience. So no, the obedience that your 10-month-old will learn is going to be directly proportionate to his cognitive ability, but also directly proportionate to his developmental stage. As he grows to 15, obedience is going to be more meaningful. That's 15 months. As he grows to 2 years of age, obedience is going to be even more meaningful. So the complexity of the obedience, that's basically what I'm saying, matches the developmental stages of the child. So yes, you start right away that you want to expect this. Don't be a threatening, repeating parent with a 10-month-old.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, too, for those of you that do have younger ones, start even using the word obey.
Obey, Mommy.
So when you're giving an instruction, that does require obedience. Just say, "You need to obey, Mommy." Even if it's your crawler and you want them to come, it might mean that initially you go and follow them and say, "No, you need to come with Mommy." You go physically. Even your toddler, you do that. You physically bring them to you and say, "You need to obey, Mommy."
That's right. Okay. Other questions? Other questions here? Okay, we got one over here. Let's see if we get the mic over. And honey, while we're getting the set up for this next question, so they're going to go home. They've heard about first-time obedience. What do? Just wake up their kids tomorrow morning and say, "Okay, this is the new rule"? Or what are some of the practical things that they can do as mothers and fathers to teach their children obedience without having to resort to some kind of a corrective discipline?
Well, of course, a lot will depend on the age of your child. The younger they are, the less amount of explanation they're necessarily going to get. But if they're old enough to understand, you sit them down and you just talk to them. They know you're going to parenting class, so they are expecting some changes to occur in their home. So don't disappoint them. And just say, last night we learned about obedience, and we've been talking about obedience in our home, but we realized that Mommy and Daddy maybe haven't had you come for first time when we call you. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play a game. We're going to, Mommy's or Daddy, you do it together. We're going to call you, and we want you to come running and say, yes, Mommy, or yes, Daddy, and we're going to give you a great big hug. And you just do that repeatedly. We had years ago when we first started to teach this, we had one of our parents, he went home, and the next day he started to teach his about almost 3-year-old daughter the whole concept, and he called her, sent her off different places 29 times. He had her come and would call her, and she'd come, yes, Daddy, and give her a big hug. And so when she went to bed that night, he says, now, starting tomorrow, when Mommy or Daddy call you, that's what you're supposed to do. You come with a yes, Mommy.
And you know what is so exciting? Moms and dads, first-time obedience, you could take this to the bank, is not a problem for your child. It's only for parents. Your children will come to first-time obedience. They'll come to any level, any standard that you set for them. You have to do it. And that means sometimes you're going to have to get up out of that chair and take care of disobedience rather than hoping that you're going to hoping to reel the child in from a distance. You're going to have to do it. Once you become consistent, maybe it takes 1 or 2 days of real consistency, and this is the standard, you'll be amazed by the 3rd day. Your child realizes, oh, okay, you're consistent, this is the standard, I'll give you first-time obedience. You want to match it, though, with that, yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy.
Just before we take the next question, there's one other part of the yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy I want to address, because I know that some of you in this class have some older children, and there'll be others that are just coming into this for the first time, and they've got a 10, 11, 12, a teenager, and it's like, I go home and come run to Mommy, I'll give you a big hug when you say yes, Mommy. That's not going to quite cut it. So when you're explaining it to an older child, you help them realize this is important because that way we know that you've heard our instructions. But the other thing, for the older children in particularly, this is a moral courtesy. For your young children, it's an absolute that you're starting out with. It's a requirement because they are in the process. But you need to address your older children with that dignity and respect that they deserve as well.
Because you're leading by your influence, it should be. And I'll use Anne Marie as an example of this. When our granddaughters, Ashley and Whitney, are over the house, and Anne Marie calls them, they are required, because they're in the process of becoming, to say, yes, Grammy. But when Ashley and Whitney call Anne Marie or call Grandpa, for us it's a habit of saying, yes, Ashley, yes, Whitney. Now, the reason we say it is because it is that moral courtesy. We've already arrived morally. It's just the right thing to do. It is a courtesy. For them, they're in the process of becoming. So when you're dealing with that older child and you're introducing it, introduce it from the perspective of courtesy, not, hey, we're in this parenting class and you're going to start doing this and I require a yes, Mom, or yes, Daddy, because you may end up with more trouble than help as a result of that approach. Okay, let's go over here. Diane.
What do you do with the child who has to have the last word?
Well, this gets right into what we're talking about. This is so typical of what happens in homes when you don't have that yes, Mommy, or yes, Daddy, because the child can debate you all the way. And no, we're not going to talk about it. But Mommy, no, I said we're not going to talk. But let me ask Dad. No, you're not going to ask Daddy. The way you deal with it is, look at Mommy's face. I want to hear from you, yes, Mommy. That is all. Yes, Mommy. That's all that can come out of your mouth. If something else comes, that is going to be disobedience. Now, what are you going to do about disobedience? Well, that's in a couple of weeks. This is just the standard. Insist, Diane, on that yes, Mommy. And again, you're going to go home and tell your children, this is what we're going to start. We're going to start working with a yes, Mommy, and a yes, Daddy. Okay? Let's take some other questions. Who's got them? John's got one. Sean's got one. It's really starting to happen here. Okay, John?
We've just been teaching our little girl to say, yes, Daddy, and we found that she's starting to mimic exactly what I was saying. So when she started to say, yes, Daddy, she would say, yes, Daddy. And it wasn't a sense of disobedience, but it was more of a sense of her taking upon exactly my comments to her, and I had to really come back and say, you need to be a happy girl, and say, yes, Daddy.
Okay. Very quickly, John, very important point. When you're dealing with the young ones, actions precede beliefs. What she is doing is fine because you are training her in a behavior, and the cognitive understanding and the moral reasoning behind it will catch up. It is better that you start the patterning of the yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy, even though she may not have a full heart understanding. But it will catch up, John. And you may want to soften it, you work on softening it, but at the same time, you just keep it going. Eventually, she'll get from her heart an understanding of it needs to be a yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy. Okay? And remember, it can't always be a happy. Happiness is one of the most elusive of all human emotions. You can't turn it on. And so when you say to your children, and we want it to be a happy one, be careful. We want it to be a content one. We want it to be a courteous one. We want it to be a respectful yes, Daddy, an honoring one. I don't know that you can make it a happy one, because that's a heart emotion that is elusive.
But the other thing, too, especially for those with the firstborn, because when you're in the process of teaching them, they will say it just like you do. I know Caitlin, there was something that, Jenny was trying to teach her how to say, may I please? And so she wasn't getting it right, and she thought, well, if I just say it right, so may I please, I mean, it was just like Jenny was helping her to get it to say. So especially with your firstborn, and I'm sure, I know that this was your firstborn, and she was younger. Now she's almost 3, so now you can almost include the moral reason why we say the yes, Mommy, in addition. But that's important, because if they say it like you're teaching them, you as the parent might think, well, she's saying that rather disrespectfully. And then you start to correct them, and the poor child is like, what did I do wrong? I said, yes, Daddy, and why are you correcting me? So it is being
literally,
careful.
they said it exactly like you said.
They said it exactly like you did.
Any other questions? We got one over here, a couple more. Sure.
When teaching first-time obedience, how do you deal with other family members, like grandparents or aunts and uncles, that continually bribe your child in order to get them to obey?
Well, it all depends whether or not the parents are Christians or non-Christians, if they want to come alongside and help, or if they just want to do what a lot of grandparents do. They just want to spoil their grandchildren. You know, Deuteronomy 4:9 speaks very clearly to the responsibility that's given over to grandparents. Moses instructing the children of Israel before they finally entered the land, that one promised generation, he said that you want to teach your children, and you will also want to teach your grandchildren. And of course, he's talking about the great moral precepts. It is a shame that sometimes we send our children off to the grandparents for a weekend, and it takes us 3 days to get them back into line once they get home. You need to encourage your parents. Maybe just share, you know, when you do that, you're undermining everything we're trying to do. Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get our children to obey out of a heart of gratitude. When you bribe them, you're corrupting them. It's beautiful if they're Christians, because then you just open up to the Exodus passage and say, Mom, this is what God said about what bribes do to children, and that's why we're not trying to bribe them. The other thing is bringing in first-time obedience and explain why. Listen, first-time obedience, I want you to consider it like a wagon wheel. The hub of the wheel, let's say, is loose. When it's loose, all the spokes, they're all loose. And every spoke is one bad behavior that the child is exhibiting. When you bring your child to first-time obedience, and it's like putting that hub on tight, all the spokes now fit. That's what first-time obedience does. It begins to eliminate almost 50% of all of your conflicts, because half of your conflicts come after the point of giving instruction. So when you bring your child to first-time obedience, and that manifests itself in front of Grandma and Grandpa, they even get used to it also. And then they will start picking up on it along with your teaching. Oh, listen, we have so much more to talk. We're just about out of time to talk to you guys about. Next week, we're going to start the encouragement side of the discipline flow chart. That's going to take us almost 3 weeks to do. We want you to get ready. You guys have plenty of homework to do. Let's go to the best part of our session, our class. Right now, we're going to go to the food time. God bless you. We'll be back next week.